The conclusion of the Anglo-Russian agreement strengthened the position of Iranian reaction, which in the course of 1907 again began to raise its head. Muhammad Ali Shah again began to surround himself with reactionaries. The Shah again brought close to him the well-known reactionary Emir Bahadurjang, who served as minister of the court. The Shah clearly patronized the ardent reactionary Rakim Khan, who, at the head of his armed gangs, was engaged in robberies in Azerbaijan. Still in April 1907, the Shah summoned the former Prime Minister Atabek Azam from abroad, who in 1903, at the request of the people, was removed from the leadership of state affairs. The Iranian public was indignant at the news of the return of the reactionary Atabek Azam. Telegrams of protest were sent to the Majlis, demonstrations took place in many cities, leaflets and proclamations were distributed against the hated dignitary. Despite this, in mid-April 1907, Atabek Azam was taken on a military ship to Anzali and then arrived in Tehran. The Shah resigned the nationalist liberal Moshe Abdul and appointed Atabek Azam in his place. This appointment caused an outburst of indignation among democratic circles and opposition from the left wing of the Majlis towards Atabek Azam. Meanwhile, the situation in the country worsened. The popular movement in the cities and provinces expanded. Tax revenue has almost completely stopped. The government was in severe financial difficulty. The capital was gripped by a food crisis, there was a shortage of bread and other products. All this further increased the hatred of the people for the new prime minister. On August 31, 1907, while leaving the Majlis, Atabek Azam was killed by Abbas Agha, a member of the Mujahideen organization. Since the autumn of 1907, Muhammad Ali Shah began to prepare for a coup d'état. The British imperialists and Tsar Nicholas II pushed him onto this path. Dispersing the State Duma, the king advised the Shah to do the same with respect to the Majlis. On the report of the Russian envoy in Tehran Hartwig, dated December 31, 1907, which reported on the critical situation in Iran and the request of the Shah to be allowed to take refuge in the Russian mission if necessary, Nicholas II wrote, "The Shah can save Persia and the throne only by the immediate dispersal of the Majlis and other revolutionary gatherings. This is my only answer." In the autumn of 1907, military units loyal to the Shah and counter-revolutionary, armed bands of feudal lords began to converge on Tehran. To the demand of the Anjuman of Tehran to remove several reactionaries from Tehran, the Shah refused and in turn demanded that the Majlis and the Council of Ministers make a decision to dissolve the Anjuman. In response to the refusal of the Majlis to do so, on December 1 and 2, troops were concentrated in Baharistar Square in front of the Majlis, who were secretly ordered to defeat the Anjuman and the Majlis. The supervision of the city was entrusted to the Cossack Brigade. The actions of the Shah caused a storm of indignation among the population of the capital and provinces. The left-wing deputies of the Majlis, members of the Tehran Anjumans, and armed detachments of the Fidai occupied the building of the Majlis and the Sepasela Mosque adjacent to it. Thousands of armed volunteers gathered in the square in front of the Majlis to defend the constitution and the Majlis. Telegrams of protest against the actions of the Shah were received from the provinces. The Tabrizian Anjuman sent a telegram to the Majlis and foreign missions, stating that the people no longer recognized the current Shah, who had violated the oath of loyalty to the constitution, and called on the Majlis to elect a new Shah. Constitution. Under pressure from this popular movement, the cabinet of ministers resigned. The balance of power was clearly not in favor of the Shah, and he was forced to give in, removing some of his close reactionaries, Saad-ed-Dole, or restricting their rights, Emir Bahadurjang. An agreement was reached between the Shah and the Majlis, sealed by a mutual oath on the Quran. The Shah pledged to preserve and observe the basic laws and principles of the constitution, and the deputies of the Majlis swore to protect the supreme rights of the Shah, and not to undermine the throne, since the Shah will fulfill its obligations. Thus, the Majlis made a deal with the Shah. However, the Anjuman and other revolutionary democratic organizations continued to fight. On February 15, 1908, an unsuccessful attempt was made on the life of Muhammad Ali Shah. A bomb was thrown into the Shah's motorcade, but the Shah remained unharmed. After that, the Shah began to gather reactionary forces around him even more actively, preparing for a new counter-revolutionary offensive. In the context of the growing struggle between the Shah and the revolutionary Anjumans, the Shah's ministers showed complete confusion cabinet after cabinet resigned. The power and authority of the Anjuman of Tehran and other cities of Iran increased more and more. In a dispatch dated April 24, 1908, the Russian envoy in Tehran, Hartwig, reported, "From my previous reports to the Imperial Ministry, it is well known what comprehensive power the Anjumans have seized into their hands. Lately they have begun to dispose of government representatives as their own agents, giving them general instructions from themselves and directly intervening in all the internal orders of each department." The struggle between the Shah and the Anjuman reached its climax in May-June 1908, when the Tehran Anjuman demanded that the Shah remove from public affairs the minister of the court, Amir Bahadurjang, who had a great influence on the Shah, his secretary Shapshal, and 4 other reactionaries from the number of persons close to the Shah. In early June, the Shah, guarded by a Cossack brigade, suddenly moved from Tehran, where the influence of the Anjuman was very strong, to his country palace, Bargashak. Here he began to prepare for a counter-revolutionary coup. The Anjuman leaders realized that the Shah was preparing to go on the offensive. Members of the Tehran Anjumans, many deputies of the Majlis and armed detachments of the Fidei, only a few thousand people, gathered in the building of the Majlis and the adjacent mosque of Sepasela to repel the Shah and the reaction. It was started to arm the population of the capital. On June 22, 1908, the Shah went on the offensive. Martial law was declared in Tehran. The commander of the Cossack brigade, Colonel Lyakov, was appointed the military governor of Tehran, who, at the direction of the Shah, demanded that the Majlis extradite the leaders of the Tehran Anjumans and left-wing deputies of the Majlis. After the Majlis refused to satisfy this demand of Lyakov, on the morning of June 23, the Cossack brigade, on the orders of the Shah, began bombarding the Majlis and the Sepasela mosque. The bombardment lasted until 12 noon. The buildings of the Majlis and the mosque of Sepasela were badly damaged. Many deputies of the Majlis and members of the Anjuman were arrested and taken to Bargish, where they were brutally massacred. Mirza Jinja Khan of Shiraz, the editor of the radical newspaper Shah Israfil, and the popular orator Malik al-Mutakallimin were hanged. The Tabriz deputy of the Majlis, Haji Mirza Ibrahim, was killed by soldiers. In total, several hundred people were killed during the bombing and after it. The popular Tabriz deputy Mostashahid Dole and several dozen other figures of the constitutional movement were shackled and kept in chains for a long time in Bargashak. Some deputies of the Majlis, among them Taghi Zaid, took refuge in the English mission. The British hid them not at all out of sympathy for the supporters of the Constitution, as English propaganda falsely and hypocritically claimed. The British imperialists simply tried to save their agents, among whom were some deputies of the Majlis. They sought to keep them in order to use them in the future to carry out their imperialist policy towards Iran. It was announced the dissolution of the Majlis and Anjumans and the creation of a state council for the appointment of the Shah instead of the Majlis. True, Muhammad Ali Shah promised to convene a new Majlis in 3 months, but he never fulfilled this promise. Thus, the Shah managed to carry out a counter-revolutionary coup and crush the revolutionary organizations in the capital. After the counter-revolutionary coup in Tehran, approximately the same events took place in the provincial centers and cities. Reaction went on the offensive everywhere. In Mashhad, Rasht and other cities, the Anjuman were closed, and their leaders were either arrested or forced to hide. But having defeated the Majlis, the Shah and the reaction could not stifle the revolution. The center of the revolutionary struggle in Iran moved to Tabriz. Back in 1906 to 1907, Tabriz was at the forefront of the revolutionary movement in Iran. The Tabriz Anjuman, who led the revolutionary movement in Azerbaijan, was the most advanced of all Iranian Enjumans. He actually established his control over the actions of the Shah authorities in Azerbaijan, and carried out a number of measures in the interests of the broad masses of the people. In June 1907, counter-revolutionary bands of the well-known robber Rakim Khan were moved against Tabriz, assisted by local Azerbaijani reactionaries. But these gangs then received a rebuff from the Azerbaijanis. By the time of the counter-revolutionary coup in Tehran, the struggle between the revolutionary and reactionary forces in Tabriz had intensified. The reactionaries have stepped up. The reactionary Enjuman Islami was formed, uniting the reactionary clergy, feudal lords and big merchants. In opposition to the revolutionary federal detachments, the reactionaries began to create armed detachments from hooligan and bandit elements. In the first half of 1908, battles between Fidai and detachments of reactionaries repeatedly took place on the streets of Tabriz. After the defeat of the Majlis, the Shah again sent the bands of Rakim Khan to help his supporters in Tabriz. At the end of July 1908, Rakim Khan, at the head of 500 horsemen, entered Tabriz. The Tabriz reactionaries perked up and went over to the offensive. Street barricade battles began in the city. At first, Rakim Khan managed to occupy most of the quarters of Tabriz, but then the population came to the aid of the Fidai, who began to crowd out the detachments of reactionaries. During this struggle, two leaders of revolutionary detachments stood out, Sattar Khan and Bega Khan, who soon gained immense popularity not only in Tabriz and Azerbaijan, but throughout Iran. Neither Sattar nor Bega were Khans by origin. Sattar came from a family of a small landowner from Karadag. For some time he served as a soldier in the convoy of the heir to the throne, the ruler of Azerbaijan. In the 1990s, he led a partisan detachment of the peasant poor. From the first days of the revolution, Sattar took an active part in it, was a member of the Tabriz Enjuman, organized detachments of Fidai, and soon became the recognized leader of the revolutionaries in Tabriz. Shah appointed 100,000 rubles for the head of Sattar. In the Russian and Western European press, Sattar was called Azerbaijani Pugachev and Persian Garibaldi. Bagir was a bricklayer. The people, in recognition of them as their leaders, called Sattar Sardar Mili, the leader of the people, and Bega Salah Mili, the commander of the people. After stubborn street battles, the Fidai detachments, led by Sattar and Bega, by October 1908 expelled the gangs of Rakim Khan from Tabriz. They seized the city's arsenal, which contained 20,000 guns, several cannons, and other weapons. The main slogans under which the Tabriz uprising took place after the counter-revolutionary coup on June 23, 1908 in Tehran, were the restoration of the constitution, the convening of a new Majlis, and the removal from the country of foreigners who supported the Shah and the reaction. After the capture of the entire Tabriz, the revolutionaries carried out a series of measures to strengthen the city and establish order in it. Even the Tsarist representatives, who were hostile to the Tabriz revolutionaries, were forced to admit that they were more concerned about order than the Shah's authorities. So, even at the height of the struggle, on July 30, 1908, the Russian consul in Tabriz Pokatonov reported that in the area where the fictitious, i.e. Shah M.I. authorities are located, all the shops are destroyed, while in the area of power of Sattar untouched. Tabriz and the approaches to it were fortified. A military council headed by Sattar and Bega was created, which established strict order among the feds and in general in the city. In addition, the so-called secret council was organized, which carried out the requisitioning of money and grain reserves from the rich, which were distributed among the poor. The Azerbaijani estates of the Shah and his relatives were confiscated. Having established their power in Tabriz, the revolutionaries began to extend it to other cities and regions of Azerbaijan, where armed Fidai detachments from Tabriz were sent to fight the reaction. Representatives of the Tabriz Enjuman were also sent to organize Enjumans, Fidai detachments, and, in general, revolutionary work in the localities. In November 1908, the Tabriz revolutionaries occupied the cities of Ma'at, Ma and Salmas, and others. The Jolfa-Tabriz road was completely cleared of reactionaries. By mid-November, a significant part of Azerbaijan submitted to the revolutionary Tabriz. In the cities and villages occupied by the revolutionaries, red flags were often raised. The spread of the influence of the revolutionary Tabriz in the regions of Azerbaijan was accompanied by the development of the peasant movement. The peasants expelled the reactionary khans from their estates, took away from them and divided the khans' cattle, grain and other supplies among the poor. In some cases, the Tabriz Enjuman and Sattar Khan opposed foreign capital and foreigners. So, for example, there were protests against the landowners, the royal subjects, who were many in Azerbaijan. At the end of 1908, the British Indo-European Telegraph Company was required to pay concession fees to the cash desk of the Tabriz Enjuman. Revolutionaries from Russia, and especially from Transcaucasia, rendered great assistance to revolutionary Tabriz. The most democratic organization of the Iranian Mujahideen was created with the direct and leading participation of the Transcaucasian Bolsheviks. Proclamations, appeals and leaflets of Iranian revolutionary organizations to the peoples of Iran were printed in Transcaucasia and then distributed in Iran. In Transcaucasia, a special group was organized to assist the Tauriz revolution. Transcaucasian revolutionaries organized the illegal shipment of weapons to Iran under the guise of sending rice, pharmaceutical goods, etc. The weapons transported across the border were delivered by special transports under guard and with red flags to Tabriz and other cities of Iran. Crossed illegally across the border and numerous squads of Transcaucasian revolutionaries heading to Tabriz. In total, several hundred Transcaucasians arrived in Tabriz in this way. The Transcaucasian revolutionaries carried out propaganda work, they held rallies, issued proclamations, took a leading part in the organization and military training of the Fidai detachments, organized a workshop for the production of bombs and grenades in Tabriz, participated in the organization of a hospital in Tabriz, and contributed to the organization of worker societies. They took a direct part in the battles with the reactionary troops and detachments. More than 20 Caucasian revolutionaries were killed in these battles. The funeral, which was attended by about 4,000 people, turned into a massive popular demonstration of Tabrizian solidarity with the revolutionary Caucasus and Russia. Revolutionaries not only from the Caucasus, but also from the central provinces of Russia, who had previously participated in the Russian Revolution of 1905, took part in the revolutionary struggle in Tabriz. Russian sailor from the battleship Potemkin, who made his way from Romania through Trebizond. Frightened by the activities of the Transcaucasian and Russian revolutionaries in Iran, Muhammad Ali Shah repeatedly zealously, in the words of Hartwig, asked the Russian Tsar to help him and prevent the transport of weapons and the passage of revolutionaries across the border from Russia to Iran. The Tsarist government several times sent orders to its authorities in Transcaucasia to establish the strictest control on the border and to persecute Russian, Transcaucasian and Iranian revolutionaries who participated in the Iranian Revolution. But, despite strict control on the Russian-Iranian border, assistance to the Iranian revolutionaries from the Transcaucasus continued to arrive. Lenin highly appreciated the Tabriz uprising. In August 1908, in the article, Combustible Material in World Politics, he wrote, "The position of the Persian revolutionaries in a country that the masters of India, on the one hand, and the counter-revolutionary Russian government, on the other, are almost ready to divide among themselves, is difficult. But the stubborn struggle in Tabriz, the repeated transfer of military happiness into the hands of the revolutionaries, who already seem to be completely defeated, shows that the Bashabazouks of the Shah, even with the help of the Russian Lyakovs and British diplomats, meet the strongest resistance from below. Such a revolutionary movement, which knows how to give a military rebuff to restoration attempts, which forces the heroes of such attempts to turn to foreigners for help, cannot be destroyed. And the most complete triumph of Persian reaction would, under such conditions, be only the threshold of new popular indignations." The Tabriz uprising had a great influence on the development of the revolutionary movement in other cities and regions of Iran. In January 1909, revolutionary unrest took place in Isfahan. The power in the city was seized by the constitutionalists, who were joined by detachments of the Berkshire tribes, who refused to follow the order of the Shah to set out on a campaign to suppress the Tories' uprising. At the beginning of 1909, a revolutionary coup was also carried out in the city of Rasht Jalan. In Mashhad and other cities and regions of Iran, the population refused to pay taxes and generally obey the Shah's authorities. In March 1909, in the south of Iran, in Bushehr and Bandar Abbas, the supporters of the constitution also seized power. The appeal of the non-Jaf mujtahids with a call to fight against the Shah, in defense of the rights of the people, spread throughout Iran. The power of the Shah, wrote Russian Foreign Minister Izvolsky in a note delivered on January 3, 1909 to the British ambassador to Russia, Nicholson, was nominal. And if circumstances continue to unfold in this direction, no one can predict when the disintegration of the Qajar Empire will stop. Under these conditions, even the governments of England and Tsarist Russia advised the Shah to promise the people the restoration of the constitution. Muhammad Ali Shah made several vague promises, but in fact he did not even think about restoring the constitution, and took all possible measures to suppress the revolutionary movement. Primarily in Tabriz, many troops were sent to South Azerbaijan. The sending of troops against Tabriz especially intensified at the beginning of 1909. The Shah's troops occupied a number of regions of South Azerbaijan. By the end of February 1909, Tabriz was blocked, and its connection with the regions was interrupted. The gangs of Rakim Khan, robbing the population, occupied the Julfa-Tabriz road. Looting and violence against the population was committed not only by the gangs of Rakim Khan, but also by the troops of the Iranian government. The Russian chargé d'affaires in Iran, Sablin, telegraphed on March 14, 1909, that the government troops in Azerbaijan, according to available information, are carrying out incredible violence against the civilian population, not sparing women and children. Tabriz will also suffer the same fate if it falls into the hands of the Shah's army. Soon, food shortages began to be felt in Tabriz, and the situation of the besieged revolutionaries worsened. But, despite this, for a long time the Shah's troops could not break the resistance of the Tabriz revolutionaries. In April 1909, fierce battles took place in Tabriz between the Shah's troops and the detachments of Sattar and Bagir. The Tabriz Enjuman proceeded to the general armament of the population. Agitators were sent to the camp of the Shah's troops in order to attract soldiers to the side rebellious people. The news about the successes of the Young Turks in Turkey had an encouraging effect on the Tabrizians. They established contact with Rasht, Isfahan and Shiraz, where an active movement was developing against the reactionary Muhammad Ali Shah and his representatives. Shah again began to threaten a serious danger. Under these conditions, the British imperialists and Tsarism launched an intervention and sent their troops to Iran. In southern Iran, the British, in fear of the threat of the revolutionary movement spreading from Iran to India, landed troops and, brutally cracking down on the participants in the revolutionary movement, occupied the cities of Bushehr, Linj, Jask and others. In Bushehr, the British defeated the local Enjuman. In other cities and towns occupied by them, revolutionary organizations and leaders were also subjected to ferocious reprisals by the British interventionists. Regarding the brutal reprisals of the British against the Iranian revolutionaries, Lenin wrote in the article Combustible Material in World Politics. The liberal English bourgeois, irritated by the growth of the labor movement at home, frightened by the upsurge of the revolutionary struggle in India, more and more often, more and more frankly, they show more and more sharply what kind beasts the most civilized European political leaders, who have gone through the highest school of constitutionalism, become when it comes to awakening the struggle of the masses against capital. Against the capitalist colonial system, i.e., the system of enslavement, robbery and violence. In the north, provocative rumors began to spread about hunger among Europeans, foreign subjects in Tabriz, about a threat to their security, about preparations for the defeat of the English and Russian consulates and the Armenian quarter, etc. On April 25, 1909, the Tsarist troops, under the pretext of protecting foreign subjects, and the need to ensure the delivery of food for them, crossed the Iranian border, and entered Tabriz 4 days later. At the same time, another detachment occupied the city of Ardabil. After that, the persecution and arrests of Transcaucasian and Iranian revolutionaries. The Tsarist troops still did not dare to disarm the Fidei detachments and arrest Sattar and Bega, who remained in Tabriz until March 1910. In March 1910, at the request of England and Russia, they were forced to leave Tabriz and move to Tehran, where they were solemnly welcomed by the population. The heroic struggle of revolutionary Tabriz tied up the main armed forces of Iranian reaction. This facilitated the development of the revolutionary struggle in other regions of Iran, primarily in the north of the country. In Gilan, as well as in Tabriz, the defeat of the Majlis in Tehran on June 23, 1908 served as an impetus for the intensification of the struggle between the revolutionary and reactionary forces. On the streets of Rasht there were skirmishes between supporters of the reaction and supporters of the revolution. A group of Armenian Dashnaks, headed by Ephraim Davidian, arrived in Rasht and settled there. In opposition to the Sattar Khan Committee, which was under the influence of the revolutionary Social Democrats, the Dashnaks created their own organization. At the beginning of 1909, the Dashnaks took part in revolutionary uprisings against the Shah's power. But later they went into the service of the Shah and the Iranian Khans, and were used to fight against the revolutionary elements, to disarm the Fidei detachments, etc. after preliminary preparations. The Revolutionary Committee, named after Sattar Khan, in early February 1909 raised an uprising in Rasht. The governor of Gilan, Sadr Afgham, was assassinated. The revolutionaries seized the Rasht arsenal. Power in the city passed into the hands of the Gilan Regional Enjuman. The rebels were joined by Sepidar, the largest landowner feudal lord of Gilan, who was in opposition to Muhammad Ali Shah. The main demands of the Gilan revolutionaries were the restoration of the constitution, the convening of the Majlis, and the overthrow of the reactionary Muhammad Ali Shah from the Shah's throne. Immediately after the establishment of the Anjuman's power in Rasht, work began to strengthen the defense of the city and to prepare for a campaign against Tehran. Colonel Lyakov, in his report dated February 14, 1908, wrote about the activities of the revolutionaries in Rasht and the role of the Transcaucasian revolutionaries. A fortification is being built at Rudbar. All these works are carried out by the former correspondent of the newspaper Rech, Painov, who enjoyed sufficient confidence in our envoy Hartwig, who had studied the Persian situation well, a brave, energetic, resolute Bulgarian who had served in the Macedonian couples. He performs the duties of Chief of Staff and Arsenal of the National Army, which he organizes and creates with the help of 500 Caucasians who flooded Rasht. The courage of the Rasht revolutionaries reaches the point that they even stop our mail and inspect it. In the same report, Lyakov, who had fallen into a panic before the growth of the revolutionary movement, wrote, "There is nowhere to go further. All the Transcaucasian militants will migrate to Persia." Simultaneously with the preparation of a campaign against Tehran, the Gilan revolutionaries sent a special detachment led by Painov to the east, to Astrabad, to help the Astrabad revolutionaries. As a result, power in Astrabad also passed into the hands of the supporters of the constitution. Thus, the Russian revolutionaries, just as in Tabriz, took an active part in the revolutionary movement in Rasht and in the campaign against Tehran. Subsequently, the activities of the Transcaucasian Bolsheviks in Gilan unfolded even more widely. At the end of the summer of 1909, by decision of the Baku Committee of the Bolsheviks, Sergo Ordzhonikidze arrived in Gilan, who stayed in Iran for a whole year, until the autumn of 1910. Comrade Ordzhonikidze provided assistance to local social democratic groups, seeking to direct their work along the Leninist path. He took part in the organization of international and political clubs of workers and artisans in Resht and Anzali, promoted Marxist ideas, held talks, lectures and reports on the Russian Revolution of 1905, explained the situation in Iran, the position of different classes, and the immediate tasks and goals of the revolution. Exposed the policy of the imperialists and Dashnaks. Tav. Ordzonikids established close ties with the democratic sections of the population of Rasht, established contact from Iran with the Bolshevik center abroad. Organized the delivery of Bolshevik publications and their distribution through international clubs among Iranian revolutionaries. Tav. Ordzonikids enjoyed great prestige among the masses. In the early spring of 1909, the Jalan revolutionaries launched a campaign against Tehran. On April 21, a detachment of 1,000 people occupied the city of Kazvin. In April, from Isfahan, the Bakhshir tribes, led by their leaders, the brothers Samsama Sultan and Sadr Assad, set out on a campaign against Tehran, who joined the supporters of the constitution. The Bakhshir Khans opposed the Shah not at all, because they were true supporters of democracy. They were dissatisfied with the Shah, who, by appointing his governors to Isfahan, tried to limit the independence of the Bakhshir Khans, who were semi-independent princelings and sought to expand their power. Opposing the Shah, they hoped to use the constitutional movement to strengthen their influence in Bakhtiari and extend it to other parts of Iran by participating in the central Iranian government. The British also pushed the Bakhshir Khans to act against the supporter of Tsarist Russia, Muhammad Ali Shah, who thus tried to undermine the influence of Tsarist Russia and strengthen their positions in Iran. The Bakhtiars were associated with the British, receiving subsidies from them for the protection of British concession roads and oil exploration in the southwestern regions of Iran. One of the prominent Bakhshir Khans, Sadr Assad, had previously traveled to Europe and had a meeting with the British Foreign Minister Grey. The news of the campaign against Tehran by the Jalan Fidai from the north and the Bakhtiars from the south caused an upsurge in the revolutionary movement in Talish, Hamadan, Fars, Luristan, Astrabad, Khorasan and other regions of Iran. At the beginning of July 1909, detachments of the Jalan Fidai and Bakhshir united near Tehran. On July 13, after 2 days of fighting with the Karsak Brigade, they entered Tehran, enthusiastically received by the population. Muhammad Ali Shah and his associates took refuge in the Royal Mission. On July 16, an emergency national council gathered, consisting of the leaders of the Fidai and Bakhshir detachments, former ministers, mujtahids and deputies of the First Majlis. He announced the deposition of Muhammad Ali Shah, the enthronement of his 14-year-old son Ahmed, and the appointment of the oldest Qajar Prince Azad el-Moq as regent. A provisional government was formed, in which Sepidar was appointed Minister of War, one of the leaders of the Bakhtiari, Sadr Assad, was appointed Minister of the Interior, and Dashnak Ephraim was appointed head of the Tehran police. For temporary, until the convocation of the Second Majlis, control over the activities of the ministers, a committee of 25 prominent constitutionalists was formed. The restoration of the constitution and the forthcoming convocation of the Second Majlis were announced. The activities of left-wing political organizations and newspapers resumed. Soon a new electoral law was published, which provided for the abolition of the curial system while maintaining the two-stage elections. Property qualification, property in the amount of 250 fogs, or payment of a tax in the amount of 10 fogs, deprivation of women's voting rights, and other restrictions. The elections to the Majlis held after that resulted in an increase in the number of landowners among the deputies, and a reduction in the number of democratic deputies. On November 17, 1909, the meetings of the Second Majlis opened. In the Second Majlis, there was a fairly strong left opposition in the form of a group of Democrats, whose leader was Soliman Mirza. But in general, the Second Majlis was even less democratic than the Majlis of the first convocation. Thus, as a result of the campaign of revolutionary detachments against Tehran and the July coup of 1909, the reactionary Muhammad Ali Shah was overthrown. But it was not a government of representatives of the democratic strata of the population that came to power, but a government consisting of liberal landowners and Bakhshir Khans. Subsequently, the influence of the landowners and the feudal aristocracy in the government increased even more. Having carried out the above measures, they considered the tasks of the revolution resolved and did everything to prevent its further development. The monarchical system and the Qajar dynasty remained inviolable. The government and the Majlis did not even try to hold the ex-Shah accountable for the bloody reactionary coup on June 23, 1908, and the defeat of the Majlis. Muhammad Ali Shah was given a lifetime pension in the amount of 100,000 fogs a year. In September 1909, the ex-Shah went abroad, where he began to prepare for the struggle for the restoration of his power with the money received from the Iranian government. The government also did not dare to touch foreign concessions, enterprises, the Cossack Brigade. The state treasury was empty. One of the new ministers said that the government did not even have money for paper and ink to draw up a program of reforms. In an attempt to overcome financial difficulties, the government introduced new taxes on carts, mules and other pack animals, etc., and increased the size of old taxes, the main burden of which fell on the shoulders of the broad masses of the people. Like Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, the government of Sepidar and the Berkshire Khans took the path of concluding foreign loans. First, it applied for a loan from Germany, but as a result of protests and pressure from England and Tsarist Russia, it was forced to abandon this attempt. In 1911, the Iranian government received a new foreign, Anglo-Russian, loan in the amount of £12.5 million. In August 1910, by order of the government, the Tehran police, led by the Dashnak Ephraim and the Berkshire detachments, supported by the Cossack Brigade, by force disarmed the detachments of the revolutionary Fidai, which were led by Sattar and Bega, who arrived in Tabriz. Russian envoy Poklevsky Kozel reported that these actions of the government caused great discontent among the population. With the disarmament of the Fidai detachments, the Iranian Revolution lost its most steadfast armed force. The leading participation of the Dashnak Ephraim in the disarmament of the revolutionary Fidai detachments once again showed the counter-revolutionary role played by the Dashnaks in the Iranian Revolution. Thus, in the field of domestic policy, the government of Sepekdar and the Berkshire Khans took the path of suppressing the revolutionary movement. In the field of foreign policy, the government did not dare to start a struggle to limit the rights and privileges of foreigners and imperialist powers. Despite the fact that anti-imperialist sentiments were very strong in the country, these sentiments found their expression in various forms. In many cities of Iran, there were mass demonstrations and rallies against the occupation of the northern and southern regions of the country by foreign Tsarist and British troops. In 1909, as mentioned above, the Tsarist troops occupied Tabriz and some other cities of Azerbaijan, and then also Rasht and Kazvin, and the British troops landed on the coast of the Persian Gulf and, shelling peaceful cities and massacring the revolutionaries, occupied Bushehr, Linj, Bandar Abbas and other cities. The Majlis protested against the foreign occupation, and in March 1910 declared national mourning on this occasion. In the Majlis, sharp anti-imperialist speeches by left-wing deputies repeatedly took place. In the autumn of 1909 and the winter of 1909-10 there was a boycott of foreign goods. Under these conditions, the government would undoubtedly have received energetic support from the people if it had decided to oppose the imperialists. But instead of leading the popular masses in their struggle against imperialist oppression, the government based its foreign policy only on maneuvering between the imperialist powers and on exploiting the contradictions between them. In the struggle against England and Tsarist Russia, the government tried to rely not on the internal forces of the country, but on imperialist powers such as Germany and the United States. Appeal to Germany for a loan was unsuccessful only as a result of pressure from England and Tsarist Russia. Then the Iranian government turned to another imperialist power, the United States, which already in the 19th century made attempts to penetrate Iran. Sent to Iran in the middle of the 19th century in order to pave the way for the expansion of the United States. American missionaries significantly expanded their activities by the beginning of the 20th century. Since the 80s of the 19th century, American Protestant missions have operated in addition to Urmia also in Tehran, Tabriz and Hamadan. They carried out their propaganda through the churches, chapels, schools and pharmacies they organized. Even more active than in the 19th century, American missionaries, doctors, and teachers played the role of spies and propagandists for American imperialism. The Iranian government's request in late 1910 to the United States to send financial advisors to reorganize Iran's financial system was perceived by the Americans as a convenient pretext for more active interference in Iran's affairs. In January 1911, the U.S. State Department decided to send 5 American advisors to Iran, led by Morgan Schuster. Schuster, who was associated with the American oil company Standard Oil, was given the task of preparing the conditions for the economic and political expansion of U.S. imperialism in Iran. In May 1911, Morgan Schuster, accompanied by his assistants, arrived in Iran. Officially, he was supposed to take the post of Chief State Treasurer and reorganize finances. On June 12, 1911, the Majlis approved the draft law drafted by Schuster on the reorganization of the financial department. Under this law, Schuster received exclusive rights and powers in the field of finance, the right to control all financial and monetary transactions of the government, the mint, taxes and other government revenues. No expense could be made without his knowledge. Its functions included the preparation of the state budget and control over its execution, control over loans and concessions. He received the authority to organize a number of financial departments, with the right to independently appoint officials to these departments. He was given the right to amend financial laws. Essentially all finances, and many branches of the Iranian economy were placed under Schuster's control. The Iranian government justified the granting of such broad powers to the Americans by saying that the United States, located far from Iran, cannot have its own special interests in Iran. That U.S. policy is supposedly determined not by imperialist goals. Iranian nationalists were generally sympathetic to this first American Schuster mission. They had not yet recognized the true face of the American imperialists and believed that this remote, and neutral, as it seemed to them, country could be opposed to England and Tsarist Russia. However, these calculations of Iranian nationalists did not materialize. The Schuster mission was an attempt by U.S. imperialism to gain a foothold in Iran and turn it into a protectorate. The exceptionally broad powers that Schuster received from the Iranian government were not needed for the reorganization of Iranian finances, but for the subjugation of Iran to the American imperialists. Schuster tried to force a foreign loan on Iran. He prepared the ground for granting concessions to the Americans for the exploitation of oil and the construction of railways, sought to ensure the widespread penetration of American goods into Iran, and planned the introduction of new taxes. Schuster established close ties with reactionary and corrupt elements. The Berkshire Khans, the Dashnak Ephraim, etc. Using the authority he received, he widely used the methods of diktat, bribery, blackmail and espionage. He organized his own secret police, and began to create a gendarmerie of 12,000 men, which he sought to replace the army. Using dictatorial methods, he tried to subjugate not only the Ministry of Finance, but also other ministries, such as the military. He tried to create his own administrative apparatus independent of the Iranian government, which was supposed to ensure the subordination of Iran to the United States. Lenin, summarizing de Mornay's book The Persian Question and the War, wrote out the following quotation from this book. The control over state finances, which they want to achieve, has become a new formula for a disguised protectorate, extremely fashionable at the moment. Having made this extract, v. I. Lenin marked in the margins, well said. Schuster acted not in the interests of Iran, but in the interests of U.S. imperialist circles, by which he was sent to Iran. It is no coincidence that 10 years later he mediated negotiations between the Iranian government and American oil companies on granting them a concession to exploit northern Iranian oil. In an effort to strengthen his position in Iran, Schuster tried to rely on the British. He tried to appoint the English officer Stokes as the head of the gendarmerie created according to his project. After the protests of Russia, officers invited from Sweden were placed at the head of the gendarmerie. On other issues, he also opposed Russia. Schuster's activities caused sharp discontent and protests from the Tsarist government of Russia. The Iranian government, which came to power as a result of the overthrow of the reactionary Muhammad Ali Shah, pursued a half-hearted and indecisive foreign and domestic policy. It was more afraid of the revolution than of the reaction, and without taking serious measures against the reactionary forces, it disarmed the main revolutionary force, the Fidai detachments. All this led to the fact that the extreme reaction again began to raise its head and become more active. The ex-Shah, who received systematic reports from his agents on the state of affairs in Iran, began to prepare to seize the Shah's throne. Agitation of his agents unfolded in Iran. Counter-revolutionary riots began in northern Iran. One of the reactionary Azerbaijani feudal lords, a supporter of the former Shah Shojueddin, came out with an armed gang against the government and laid siege to Tabriz. In Kurdistan, the brother of the ex-Shah, Salah ad-Dawla, was openly preparing to attack the government. In July 1911, Muhammad Ali, considering the situation favorable for a counter-revolutionary coup, with the help of the Tsarist authorities, crossed the Caspian Sea on a steamer and landed on its southeastern coast in Gomiashtepe. Here he managed to win over to his side the reactionary leaders of the Turkmen tribes, who systematically engaged in robberies. With their help, he recruited about 30,000 people from the Turkmen tribes and moved to Tehran. The Turkmen leaders willingly supported the Shah not only as a result of his bribery, but also because they hoped to use the campaign against Tehran as an opportunity for robberies. The Turkmen feudal lords were interested in restoring the old order, under which they could raid and rob the civilian population of villages and cities with impunity, and therefore sympathized with the plans of Muhammad Ali. Simultaneously with the speech of the ex-Shah and his campaign against Tehran in Kurdistan, his brother Salah ad-Dawla raised a reactionary rebellion. The news of the appearance in Iran of the reactionary Muhammad Ali and his campaign against Tehran caused an explosion of popular indignation in the country and raised the people to fight against the ex-Shah and the reaction in defense of the constitution. Mass rallies and demonstrations took place all over Iran, the participants of which demanded that the government take immediate and decisive measures to defeat the counter-revolutionary gangs of Muhammad Ali and Salah ad-Dawla. Volunteer revolutionary detachments of armed Fidai began to be created again. Government troops were sent against the gangs of the Shah and his brother, which were joined by numerous volunteers Fidai. In the fall of 1911, the gangs of the ex-Shah and Salah ad-Dawla were defeated by the combined forces of government troops and volunteer detachments. Muhammad Ali fled abroad again. After the ex-Shah's gangs were defeated, the Majlis passed a law on the confiscation of the property of the former Shah and the main participants in his rebellion. On the basis of this law, in Azerbaijan, by order of Schuster, an inventory was made of the property of the ex-Shah's brother, Shohreh Sultan. Since the property of this prince was pledged in the Russian Accounting and Loan Bank of Persia, a conflict arose between the Tsarist consul in Tabriz and representatives of the Schuster administration. In November 1911, the Tsarist government, together with England, presented Iran with an ultimatum. It demanded that Schuster be resigned, that the costs of maintaining the Tsarist troops in Iran be reimbursed, and that foreign advisors no longer be invited without the knowledge and consent of Tsarist Russia and England. The ultimatum, which violated Iran's sovereignty, caused an uproar. Mass rallies and demonstrations took place everywhere under the slogan, "Death or Independence." A boycott of foreign goods began. The Majlis rejected the ultimatum. In response to this, the Tsarist government sent new troops to Azerbaijan, Gilan and Khorasan. England sent its troops to the southern regions and cities of Iran. The revolutionary detachments offered armed resistance to the Tsarist troops in Tabriz, Anzali, Rasht and Mashhad. The resistance was especially stubborn in Tabriz, where the fighting lasted until the first days of January 1912. The Tsarist command sent new military units with artillery to Tabriz. Only after that, with the help of counter-revolutionary bands, the Tsarist troops defeated the revolutionary detachments and occupied Tabriz. The occupation of Tabriz was accompanied by executions, violence and robberies by counter-revolutionary gangs. The southern cities of Iran were occupied by British troops, who suppressed the revolutionary movement with extraordinary cruelty. The cities of northern Iran, Anzali, Rasht, Kazvin, Astrabad, Mashhad, and others were occupied by the royal troops. In Mashhad, for the purpose of provocation, the supporters of the reaction organized a best in the mosque of Imam Reza, presenting a demand to restore Muhammad Ali Shah to the throne. This gave the Tsarist command an excuse to bombard the mosque of Imam Reza, from where the provocateurs, who had been warned in advance, had left even before the bombardment. Following this, detachments of revolutionary Fidai were also disarmed in Mashhad, and a regime of counter-revolutionary terror was established in the city. Taking advantage of the intervention of the Tsarist troops in the north and the British in the south of Iran, the Iranian reaction, with the help of the detachments of the Dashnak, Ephraim and the Bakhshia, in December 1911 carried out a counter-revolutionary coup in Tehran. Detachments of Ephraim and Bakhtiars occupied the building of the Majlis. The Majlis was dissolved, and the reactionary feudal aristocracy, led by the Qajar clique, again came to power in Iran. The government accepted the Anglo-Russian ultimatum. Most Iranian newspapers were closed. Revolutionaries were persecuted and executed throughout the country. Defeat of the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911 explained by many reasons. The following should be recognized as the most important of them. 1. Despite the fact that in some cities and provinces, Tabriz, Azerbaijan, Rasht, Gilan, the broad masses of the people took an active part in the revolutionary movement. Nevertheless, the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911 was not a revolution in which the main democratic sections of the population would play an independent and active role in the main centers of the country. The weak development of the working class, the almost complete absence of an industrial proletariat in Iran at that time, had an effect. The peasantry took an insufficiently active part in the revolution. The peasant movement against the Shah authorities and Khans, although it took place in almost all regions of Iran, was widely developed only in Azerbaijan and Gilan. As a rule, the movement of the peasants was poorly organized, spontaneous, scattered, local. First of all, it took the form of passive resistance, refusal to pay taxes, etc. The peasants, who made up the bulk of the population, were not yet sufficiently involved in the political life of the country, and in such an agrarian country as Iran, the success of the revolution depended on the extent to which the peasants took part in the revolutionary struggle. 2. With the exception of Tabriz, Resht and a few other cities and regions, the masses of the people have not been able to put forward leaders from among themselves capable of giving the right direction to the revolutionary activity of the masses. As a result, the Iranian liberals, bourgeoisie, liberal landlords, and at the beginning of the revolution, the higher clergy, everywhere, except for Tabriz and partly Rasht, managed to keep the leadership of the revolution in their hands and take advantage of the revolutionary mood of the people and their successes and victories, for example, a campaign against Tehran and the overthrow of the Shah in July 1909, etc. Retaining leadership of the revolutionary movement, the Iranian liberals tried to delay the development of the revolution, to prevent its deepening and further development of the anti-feudal and anti-imperialist struggle. Fearing a deepening of the revolution, the liberals embarked on the path of agreement with feudal reaction and imperialism. On the path of fighting the revolution, the disarmament of the Fidai detachments in 1910, and other concessions to the reaction and the imperialists. The absence of a truly revolutionary leadership contributed to the defeat of the revolution. 3. The revolution in Iran was opposed not only by the forces of internal Iranian reaction, but also by the imperialist powers, who at the decisive moment sent their troops to suppress the revolution. The victory of reaction and the defeat of the revolution of 1905 in Russia contributed greatly to the defeat of the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911. Iranian Revolution 1905 to 1911 was a bourgeois anti-feudal, and anti-imperialist revolution, with very strongly developed elements of the bourgeois democratic movement, Azerbaijan, Gilan. It was an integral part of the revolutionary wave that swept through the countries of the East at the beginning of the 20th century: Iran, Turkey, India, China, after the Russian Revolution of 1905, and which Lenin called the awakening of Asia to a conscious political struggle for democracy. The Iranian Revolution was faced with the task of combating feudal remnants and the domination of imperialism. The Iranian Revolution showed that Iran, like other countries of the East, had entered a new era in its historical development, the era of bourgeois democratic revolutions. In the article, On the Right of Nations to Self-Determination, V.I., Lenin wrote, "In Eastern Europe and Asia, the era of bourgeois democratic revolutions only began in 1905. Iranian Revolution, 1905 to 1911 began and proceeded under the influence of the revolutionary events of 1905 in Russia. But it, in turn, had a revolutionary influence on other countries of the East. Following Iran, under the influence of the Russian Revolution, an anti-imperialist popular movement arose in India in 1906 to 1908. In 1908 the Young Turk Revolution began in Turkey, and in 1911 the revolution in China. Of all the revolutions of the beginning of the 20th century in the East, the bourgeois democratic features were most clearly expressed in the Iranian Revolution. In Iran, the broad masses of the people took a more active part in the revolutionary movement than, for example, in Turkey. In the course of the revolution, they created such forms of revolutionary organization as Enjumen, which were a kind of embryo of revolutionary democratic power. Fidai detachments, a Free People's Revolutionary Guard, Mujahideen organizations, and put forward their own program of demands and slogans, the program of the Mujahideen. The revolutionary struggle in Iran in a number of cases assumed the highest and most decisive form of armed insurrection, Tavriz, Resht. At the first stage of the Iranian Revolution, the national bourgeoisie, liberal landlords, clergy, urban petty bourgeoisie, artisans, urban poor, workers and peasants participated in the movement. Very soon, two trends emerged in the revolution: 1. Democratic, workers, peasants, artisans, urban petty bourgeoisie and urban poor, and 2. Liberal, big bourgeoisie, landowners and higher clergy. If the democratic wing of the revolution sought to complete the bourgeois democratic and national liberation revolution, then the liberal wing, after convening the Majlis, proclaiming the constitution and carrying out certain reforms, considering the tasks of the revolution basically solved, began to gradually move away from the revolution and embarked on the path of struggle against democracy and collusion with the reaction. If Russian Tsarism and the British came out in defense of the Iranian reaction against the revolutionary movement, then revolutionary Russia, led by the Bolsheviks, resolutely opposed the reactionary policy of Tsarism towards the Iranian Revolution and gave the Iranian Revolution every support. We have already spoken about the assistance of the Transcaucasian and Russian revolutionaries to the Iranian Revolution. Lenin during the revolution in his articles repeatedly spoke out in its defense and exposed the policy of Tsarism and England, who, together with the Iranian reaction, sought to strangle the revolution. The Russian Bolsheviks, who gathered shortly after the suppression of the Iranian Revolution at the Prague Conference, at the suggestion of Lenin, adopted a special resolution on the attack of the Russian government on Persia, which stated, "The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party is protesting against the predatory policy of the Tsarist gang, determined to strangle the freedom of the Persian people, and does not stop in this before the most barbaric and vile acts." The conference states that the alliance of the Russian government with the government of England, advertised and supported by the Russian liberals in every possible way, is directed primarily against the revolutionary movement of Asiatic democracy, and that this alliance makes the British Liberal government an accomplice to the bloody atrocities of Tsarism. The conference expresses its full sympathy with the struggle of the Persian people, and in particular with the struggle of the Persian Social Democrats, party that suffered so many victims in the fight against the Tsarist rapists. The attitude of the Mensheviks towards the Iranian Revolution was exactly the opposite. They treacherously declared the peasant, workers, and, in general, the entire democratic movement in the Iranian Revolution to be reactionary. Despite the fact that the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911 was suppressed, it was of great importance in the history of Iran. It awakened the broad working masses to a conscious political life, and to the struggle against the prevailing survivals of feudalism and imperialist oppression. It opened a new period in the history of Iran, the period of bourgeois democratic and national liberation revolutions. Iranian Revolution, 1905 to 1911 dealt a blow to the feudal system and the Qajar monarchy. It led to the proclamation of a constitution and to the creation of the first long-standing parliament in the eastern countries, the Majlis. It undermined the feudal system and to a large extent contributed to the preparation of conditions for the overthrow of the Qajar dynasty and for the struggle for national independence and independence that unfolded in Iran after the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia.